Hello, people. Andrew here, talking about comics from a reader, collector, speculator, investor point of view, in that order of importance to myself. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. And so began the 1930 radio show Detective Story Hour. It was a project by a magazine publisher called Street and Smith, who had a magazine called Detective Story Magazine. And the radio show was an effort to prompt sales for that particular magazine. And it sort of worked because what happened, they discovered, is that people were interested in reading stories about the shadow. But there were no stories about the shadow, he was just the narrator. So Street and Smith, seeing the writing on the wall, decided that they would create a character called the Shadow, and they hired Walter B. Gibson to chronicle his adventures. And a year later, the Shadow was in magazine form. There were over 300 Shadow stories in short stories, novellas, novels. It was translated into film, into serialized features that played before a film, and into comic books. One of the major comic book publishers of The Shadow was DC Comics, or is DC Comics. But the property has moved around from various publishers. I'm specifically going to be talking about one point in time for The Shadow, which was from 1987 to 1989. It was a 19 issue series with two annuals. So I can't talk a lot about what happened in the 70s, and I can't talk a lot about what happened afterwards because I haven't read any of those books. I have just read this series. Now, prior to this series, there was a four-issue series by Howard Chaykin. I haven't read that, although I like Howard Chaykin's stuff and I'd be interested in reading it. And what he did was he took the Shadow from the 30s, where his origins were and where he was based originally, and brought him up to date. In this case, it would have been up to the 80s, and wrote stories if the Shadow was here and now in the 80s. Um, so going into this series, it helps if you have read that series because this series begins where that one left off, which is why there was a great deal of confusion for myself when I first started reading this series, especially the first six-issue arc. The six-issue arc, like one of the things I didn't know a lot of things about the Shadow. Number one is that you'd be forgiven if you thought that his alias was Lamont Cranston. I've heard that name a number of times associated with the Shadow, and I always thought that was his alias, but it's actually Kent Allard, or Allard. And at one point in time in a story, there was a character, a fictional character called Lamont Cranston, who looked a lot like the Shadow, or should I say that the Shadow looked, or Kent Allard looked a lot like Lamont Cranston. So basically, the Shadow then. This Lamont Cranston was a millionaire and a jet setter, and he traveled an awful lot. The Shadow approaches him and says, "Listen, while you're away on your exotic trips, I'm going to assume your identity and go to all these functions because that's how I can gather up some of my information. And if you don't agree with me, I'm just going to take over your life entirely, including all of your fortune." For whatever reason, this works, and so when Lamont Cranston is abroad, the Shadow can adopt that personality. I think it's one of the earliest cases of identity theft. So he's not really Lamont Cranston, he's Ken Aller. But I didn't know this. I also didn't know that, much like Doc Savage, another pulp character from around the same period of time, he had a group of agents or allies that worked with him. I think there was five of them. Each of them had different skills and abilities, and they helped Doc Savage solve some of his crimes and provide technical support, physical support, security, whatever was necessary. I didn't realize that the Shadow also had a team of agents, an actual broader base of agents that worked for him. So, not knowing these things and starting this series, I was very confused and it's very chaotic. There are so many agents in the Shadow's world. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know their special abilities. I could not tell if they were specifically an agent for the Shadow or just an ally as a resource for the Shadow, or if they were just bystanders within the story, like a bartender or a beat cop. So I was left a little confused by who was doing what because it jumps right in with this is what's going on. Not only that, but this first story arc has the idea of Lamont Cranston, who was believed killed, maybe even by the Shadow, I don't know. But he's not dead, and he shows up in a hospital. And now I've got two Lamont Cranstons, and I've got some of the agents that are saying this risen from the dead real Lamont Cranston is the Shadow. And then the Shadow shows up and says, "No, I'm the Shadow. That's just Lamont Cranston." And it's like, I don't know what's going on here. It was a strange way to begin a series, especially for somebody just coming into it. So, and if you hadn't read the 4 issues prior, you'd be as lost as I was. Now, the artwork was provided by Bill Sienkiewicz, and Bill Sienkiewicz had an opportunity to actually ink his own work. And I like, this is a good example of why I like his artwork. This is a cover, obviously, but here's an idea of the interior stuff. All right, so you can see that he uses negative space, he uses silhouettes and deep shadows. There's a little bit of distortion in some of his artwork, especially Nurse Gwendolyn here, right here. Um, and there's movement on the page. There's sort of a rough look to the artwork as well. I really like this style of artwork that he does here, and I think it adds a great deal of character to this book. He's a little bit. It's a little bit darker book with because much of it happens in the shadows. So, and it is a crime book, and it's a detective crime story. As I said, and I really liked the artwork in this one for the first 6 issues. For that alone, it's worth a read. The story itself, as I say, there's all of these agents and this strange confusion between who is Lamont Cranston. There is a crime happening and being developed not in the background, but as part of the story. And for a number of issues, I'm just saying, who, what is actually happening here? Who's working for who? Who's on the side of righteous and who's not? It does tie together somewhat by the end of it, by the 6th issue, but a very strange way to begin something if you're fresh and not knowing anything at all about the Shadow. After 6 issues, Bill Sienkiewicz leaves the book, and Kyle Baker comes on. But Kyle Baker first inks a one-shot that's illustrated by Marshall Rogers. This is the one-shot. Now, having read the previous 6, there are agents involved in it. The Shadow is there. I actually really like this story an awful lot. It's about a small kid who gets a chance to go to Washington, and he has it in his head to assassinate the president because he's hoping to create a war, in which case he can be a soldier like his dad was. Did I give away too much? Maybe. But it's a really good story. I really enjoyed the story, and I enjoyed the work by Marshall Rogers. And the writer who's wrote for the whole series was Andy Helfer, who's better known as an editor at DC as opposed to a writer, although he's written other material as well. The entire thing was all written by Andy Helfer. It's a very, not just this one, but the whole series is very, well, complex is not quite the word. I suppose it's complex in that there's a lot of characters that weave in and out of the storyline. Sometimes their paths cross as they're going on their own exercise to help out the Shadow, and sometimes they actually mingle and sort of pair up a bit. But there are an awful lot of agents and a criminal element. And you know what's a surprising lack of? There's a lack of the Shadow. And I think that's what threw me a little bit about this particular series as well. When the shadow does appear, much like the shark in Jaws, he's very effective. But I would have liked to have seen more stories about the shadow as opposed to what follows. So this was the one shot that I really liked. And then after that, there were two more 6-issue arcs, the Seven Deadly Fins, and another 6-issue arc called Body and Soul. This particular arc is my favorite of the series. It's really I'm going to say traditional only in the sense that it is a traditional crime detective story, but there's really not a lot that's traditional about the way it's told. By now, I know a little bit more about the agents, I'm not trying to catch up. And there's a deeper crime going on involving the Finn family and the Shadow's efforts to take them down. And they're all involved in various criminal enterprises. So there's a lot of story happening here. Because there's a lot of story happening within this book, the artists, both Bill Sienkiewicz and Kyle Baker, have to focus a little. Their paneling isn't as expressive as it could be in some other books. In other words, you'll get 6 to 9 panels per page, the occasional splash page, the occasional larger panel or stretched panel. But because there's so much story, and there's a lot to fill in, they have to use smaller images. It doesn't hurt the book, and actually it helps give the idea that the claustrophobic nature of the city itself. And in both cases, both artists do a good job of narrating the story through artwork. They're sort of a little bit forced to make sure that that happens because, as I say, there's so much going on. Of the 3 main arcs, this is my favorite arc because, as I say, it's closest to what I was expecting about the Shadow. Was a crime detective type of story. It's a lot of fun. It's dark humor. It's not cut and dried straight drama. It's dark humor. There are some pretty funny moments in there, but it's very situational. I just talked about The Boys not so very long ago, and I watched the show, and that's dark humor. If you like dark humor, it's not quite as violent as that one, but if you like dark humor, this is a dark humor style of book. So after this arc, then there was the final 6-issue arc called Body and Soul, and somewhere along there was 2 annuals as well. So Body and Soul, I enjoyed that part as well. I thought it was interesting, but I was a little disappointed because it was primarily about the agents. And they're interesting characters. I particularly like Gwendolyn the nurse. And they are interesting. All of them have like little interesting little bits and tidbits. But the 6-issue arc is, what do they do when the Shadow's away? What would their life look like without the Shadow? It's interesting, but I'm really more interested in the Shadow. And unfortunately, he gets sort of involved in a storyline that's like a variation of Weekend at Bernie's. And in case you don't remember that one, it's about 2 guys with I think it's a dead uncle, and they have to pretend that he's alive. Anyways, it's along those lines of a Weekend at Bernie sort of experience, which is comical, which is the dark humor involved. But there just wasn't enough of the actual Shadow in the last story arc for me to give it any raves. It was decent enough, but I prefer stories involving the Shadow. As far as the artwork, Kyle Baker, a little surprise here. Kyle Baker, I remember it's about 10 or 15 years after this, he did a series called Truth, which was sort of a Captain America based series, and his artwork is very loose and at times almost cartoonish. But here, he seems to have reined it in a little bit and sort of follows the tone that was set by Bill Sienkiewicz. And I appreciate that. I think the artwork in the entire 19-issue run is worth taking a look at. So overall, what is my recommendation as far as reading it is concerned? And I struggled with this one because it is such an offbeat kind of quirky story that doesn't really fit into many normal sort of story zones. But ultimately, I would say yes. I would say yes because the artwork. I think the artwork is good, and I think it's a quirky but interesting story. The only caveat is if you're not interested in that sort of thing or the dark humor that comes along with it, then you might want to give this one a pass. If anything, read that single issue by Andy Halfer and Marshall Rogers about when Harold goes to Washington. That would give you an indication of what the book is like. You can read it without knowing too much about the Shadow or any of the agents, and it is a good standalone story, and it gives you a good indication of what surrounds it and the rest of the series. As far as collectability, well, the Shadow, as I said, has got a home at DC for a number of books. There was a series in the 70s. There was the Howard Chaykin series prior to this, and there was a series after this. There was a number of other publishers that also published The Shadow. So there's, if you're interested in that character, this would fit within that collection. Bill Sienkiewicz, Kyle Baker, both artists that do have followings, and they do contribute to this book. So there would be that reason to collect this book as well. As far as speculation or investment, unfortunately, the answer would be no on both of those counts. It's not the first appearance of anything. No other characters, interact with the Shadow here. It's a good story, but it doesn't have that kind of value attached to it. You can probably buy the entire series for about, well, I'm going to say $20 because that's a buck a book from the dollar bin pretty much. Um, it may cost you a little bit more because it may be a little bit harder to find. And when a dealer does get some of these books in, they may put it in a $2 to $5 a piece book, and maybe even number one put it at that kind of price. But then on the other hand, I have seen books from the 70s that go directly to a dollar bin when somebody gets them in, just because they have so much stock. And this is not going to be a prime mover. If they get it in on somebody's collection, if I was to sell this in a collection of 500 books, quite possibly these would just be bam, 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 right into the dollar bin. So if you hunt around, you can probably find it for a dollar a piece, and so that's why I'd say the value is about $20 to buy the whole thing. Overall, a good read if you can hunt it down, especially start with that single issue. Uh, this one here. For the reading purposes, and as I said, there's the artwork as well. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon. See you, peoples.